So before we begin, I should probably explain the look. Maybe not, maybe you'll see it and think to yourself, this is totally normal for her, which fair. I have actually just returned from a dance show that I did for the dance society at my uni, and it was so fun. And this is the t-shirt, and underneath I have like the dance costume, and so that's why I like the pigtails. Although I must say, I do like them. Am I too old to wear them now? Probably, but I like how they make me feel. Anyway, that's what this is. Moving on to the video. Hello everybody, I'm Roxy, this is Chaotic Bibliophile, and today I come to you with my October wrap-up. I know I still owe you the book club wrap-up for November, and ideally it would have been up this week. It's just that I really didn't want to have another month go by without doing the October wrap-up. You know, it's already December, so let's get on with it. I had a very successful month in October. I didn't read a lot of books, but I read some pretty amazing books. And I also read some that I didn't love as much. So let's start with those, shall we? First, this one that is all marked up because it was the first text I had to read for uni, and it's The Golden Bowl by Henry James. It is about two old-time friends. They are both British. They clearly like each other, maybe even more than that, but they can't get married because both of them are high-class aristocracy, but they have no money, which, you know, is a common theme in turn of the century, early 20th century English and American fiction. This reads very English and European. Henry James was American, but he was very fascinated with Europe in a way that it's very like in love, but also critical, and he has some very interesting takes. The guy from the couple of friends, it's a man and a woman, and the man marries an American heiress. She is not aristocracy, but she has a lot of money, and the friend ends up marrying her dad. It's a weird foursome going on. This started out so great. I know a lot of people don't like how Henry James writes. I actually really enjoy it, and I just find it really interesting how he gets into the psyche and the subjectivity stuff. I like all of that. But this was way too long. Henry, my friend, you needed a friend like Edith Wharton, who did say that the characters were stilted and he just left them in suspension, and that's totally true. It started out so good. The first two books in here are amazing. Yes, it's divided into books. I couldn't get enough of them, and then it dragged, and it kept dragging on. It just needed an editor to go. So in the end, I did not really enjoy this, and it ended up being such a chore. I would be up to reading more Henry James, especially The Ambassadors and The Bostonians are two that I really want to read. Probably also Washington Square. Another book that I'm sad I didn't love is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is my first Butler, and it might be my last. This is a very beloved classic of sci-fi wherein this woman in the, I want to say 80s, she's black and she goes back to slavery times, and she realizes she needs to keep saving this white boy that is her, I want to say great-grandfather, but basically part of her line. And if she doesn't, then she won't exist. I love everything that happens here. The pacing of it especially, I didn't expect it to be so all-encompassing. For some reason, I thought this was going to happen just a couple of times when her ancestor was a child. But no, it actually happens throughout his life. And so it really lends itself to some great exploration of themes, not only of racism, but also class and gender, and of course, slavery. It is a fascinating book in its themes. I just didn't like the writing at all. And there were things that drove me insane. So for example, over-explanation, the dialogues. Oh, I just think the writing is really not for me, but I think a lot of people that like fast-paced books with interesting themes will like this. So those are the books that I didn't enjoy very much. Now I have, oh no, actually I have one more book to tell you about that I read as an ebook, and it's called Double Game by Sophie Calle. This I also read for uni. It's art, auto-fictional, not fictional, because I think she actually does do the stuff that she mentions in the book. Basically, this conceptual artist who I think was the inspiration for a Paul Auster character, and so she does the opposite and she follows the character in order to, I don't even know what it is, like explore the ramifications of having fiction and someone else have that sort of control over your life. I think it's sort of the point. This is one of those things that is like interesting in concept, but it's really self-indulgent, and after a while it gets old. So she does a bunch of weird stuff like manic pixie dream girl sort of stuff based on the book, and she spent years on this. So it's more of a piece of conceptual art than anything else, more than like an actual book, but it does contain big excerpts of Paul Auster's writing, a lot of pictures and evidence sort of her experiments. After you get what the experiment is, it's sort of not interesting enough to see it through. So for example, she worked at a hotel as a maid and she took pictures of the empty places, which very unethical, but like, let's say that's all right, they never found out, it was fine, it's very anonymous. But after the first 4 or 5, you just don't want to read her reports or see the pictures of these rooms. So I don't know, I feel like if you really enjoy performance art and if you really enjoy that sort of gimmick, then it is interesting. It is the sort of book that is interesting to think about. But again, after a while, it gets very old and I wish it were shorter. Now let's move on to the books I love. Let's first talk about a complete surprise. This is Look at Me by Anita Brookner. I have noticed that they have just reissued all Anita Brookners, or like a lot of them, in these editions that I think are very nice. And I got this at Mr. B's Emporium of Reading Delights in Bath. It caught my eye for obvious reasons, but this was actually a staff pick, and I always check those out in indie bookstores in particular because they put tons of effort in doing that. I'm so happy I did, and I am going to read so many more Anita Brookner books because this is so well written and so unexpectedly meta. It's about Frances, a young woman who wishes to be a writer but hasn't really dedicated herself to it. In the meantime, she works in a medical library and she gets involved with this married couple, one of the doctors and his wife. And if you've read Conversations with Friends and thought the themes were cool, but their writing could be more interesting, this is a really good alternative for that. Frances is arguably writing about this couple and everyone she meets. And there are lots of passages reflecting upon writing about people you meet and about their stories and whose stories are they really and who can tell them. And then you realize, oh, this might be the book that she's writing about them, you know, but she also inserts herself. There are so many layers of unreliability and so much toxicity. I just found it super fascinating. I devoured it. I really recommend it. Prose really good, really interesting. It feels very fresh. Although it originally came out in the 80s, so that's how you know you've got a good one in your hands. And she has so many books and a lot of them sound super interesting. I think her most famous is Hotel du Lac, promoted here, and I do want to read that one, but I purchased a different one at a secondhand bookshop and I think I'm going to read that first. Then something not necessarily similar, but I feel like if you like one, you like the other. That is When I Lived in Modern Times by Linda Grant. This won the Orange Prize for Fiction, and it also won the Women's Prize for Fiction, which is why I read it, because I needed a Women's Prize winner for a challenge. And I honestly didn't expect to like this as much as I did. It's basically about this British Jewish young woman at the beginning of this. Actually, I think at the beginning of this, she might be a child due to unfortunate circumstances and her mother passing away. She needs to move to Israel and cue a lot of discussions about Zionism, about Jewish identity, about narratives in terms of politics and propaganda and how all that operates. And what is so interesting about it is that it doesn't have that contemporary feel of a lot of essay-like digressions. And I'm not saying I don't like that style. I do, if done well. But it's also so great to see them so ingrained in the narrative, but you still get the characters, especially the narrator, who's the protagonist. She is very resilient, very pragmatic, but at the same time, she is still wondering sort of who she is and how she can adapt to these things. She also gets involved with many men, some of which are involved in armed, guerrilla-like organizations, and the way she writes about it is just so good. I didn't expect the prose to be so addictive. It's not super flowery, it's actually not sparse either. It's just very straightforward, but in a way that has a spark, and it's not plain or empty. It just works so well. It was a voice I wanted to keep reading, and that is always great to read. So I really recommend this, and it's one of those books that I think is now more relevant than ever. She hangs out with some people who really believe in a Zionist state, right? But she can tell that that's not the whole story, and she asks questions, and the way she interrogates that, being Jewish, is so fascinating. The other aspect of it is that she isn't really Jewish the same way the other people in Israel are Jewish. She is British, and she often feels British first, and she has the accent. It also talks about that privilege because she can totally pass as British. Really solid novel. I really recommend it. Then a book I will only mention that I love, but I already uploaded a video about it, and that is The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson. I just really enjoy Shirley Jackson. I have a couple more books by her. I don't know if I'll get to them before the year ends. I do have a lot on my plate right now, but definitely next year. And if you want to hear more about that, you can check out my book club spoiler-free review and discussion. Link down below and in the eye, as always. A book that has kind of an interesting story. I'd always had it in the back of my mind, but not as, okay, I need to get this book right now. And then I found it at the secondhand shop I volunteer at. And then I saw a Mark Nash video where he mentioned this book and how much he loved it. And I commented on that video, which I almost never do. I'm so bad at commenting right now. I'm sorry, guys. I know that I love watching you guys. Anyways, not the point. The point is that I commented on that video and I said, I just bought this. Now you bumped it up the TBR. And he replied saying, I really should check it out. And I'm so glad I listened because I really enjoyed it. And this is Some 40 Tales from the Afterlives by David Eagleman. David Eagleman is a neuroscientist and he has published several books on the brain. Honestly, I want to read one of them, but I don't know which one because I've seen like 3 and they all look very similar. But I do want to read at least one. In any case, these are, let's call them microfiction. They're basically little nuggets, like the longest might be 5 pages long, maybe not even that. They are all about the many possibilities, and in being about the afterlife, they are of course also about life and creation. It is so hilarious and heartbreaking. It's also a bit mind-blowing. Some of the scenarios are honestly super fascinating and you have to think, how did he come up with this? But then some others are really cheeky and all of them are super well written. I don't think it will be for everyone if you really want a story. If you, for example, haven't tried philosophy but like really would like to, or like genre-bending stuff, I think you'll enjoy this. It's again, very enlightening in many ways. In others, it's just simple but nice. Really makes you reflect upon the possible meanings of life and the origins of life and having fun with the concept, but at the same time, take it very seriously. Oh, and it's second person, which is always a risky bet, but in this case, it really pays off. It really confronts you and puts you in these scenarios. So I think it's very effective. Really recommended. Tiny little book, but packs a punch. Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow. Yes, I'm years late to the party, but here I am. This is not the investigation that Ronan Farrow did regarding the Weinstein case, which I feel like it is sold as often, and I feel like that might be why a lot of people are disappointed by it. However, if you know that this is the account of him trying to put together his expose on the Weinstein sexual abuse cases, then it's so well done. First of all, the topic is already intense because it's not just the Weinstein thing, his interviews with the victims and everything he had to do to engage with them, but also trying his best to be super respectful about it and trying his best to not re-victimize them, which is super important when dealing with this kind of stuff. But also just all the pushback he had to endure and the way he was risking his job, and at some point he suspected his life and he feared this might be the case, and he thought, for example, he was being followed, but then he was like, nah, I can't be that paranoid. But then he was being followed. It's also amazing how he took pains to fact check everything, the discussions on journalistic ethics and what it is that a journalist can and cannot do, how you go about it, the mechanics of journalism. It's really, really interesting. I really, really enjoyed it. Danny, who does the podcast with me, link down below to both our podcasts in Spanish and in English, is a journalist. She also really enjoyed seeing that side of this, which I think is actually the main side. I was just so engrossed. There was one day where I was reading this on the tube, and when I got to my station, I said no out loud. People looked at me like I was a weirdo. I am a weirdo. I also really admire the way that Ronan Farrow just pieced together the narrative, because there are many things that he found out about later, but he did include in chronological order, and he did call attention to that. What I will say though, which is not the fault of the book, I just think is the fault of how globalized everything is. This is very US centric. This was written with a US audience in mind, and I think that's totally fine because it deals with that sort of politics, but it has been translated to Spanish, for example, and I don't know what other languages. And I think it's very important to note that if you don't know the people in here, he doesn't explain them. I think that is the right choice, because if he did, his primary audience, which is of course people in the US, would have been like, why are you over explaining this? And he does explain, for example, who models that people might not know who they are, and he explains their connection to the story. But there are a lot of people in here that if you are a semi-engaged US citizen, you would know. And so if you're not, you may feel a bit lost. As I said, I don't think this is a criticism of the book, because it's not the responsibility of this type of work to be appealing to the entire world. But because the US is the US, of course, this has been sold in many parts of the world. And so I just think I need to call attention to that. So that is my disclaimer. Either way, I think this is a superb work of journalism, as I said, and it's just such a great book. I would totally reread it. Even though I knew the outcome, I was so nervous reading it. So good. If you like Ronan Farrow, I really recommend his long-form podcast interview. If I can find it, I will link it down below so you can go check it out if you haven't. He talks and comes across exactly as you would think from reading the book, and vice versa. I actually listened to the interview first, and so reading the book, it was like, oh yeah, I can totally see that. So that was my October wrap-up. As you can see, I consider October very successful, actually more successful than November, because I have read a lot in November. Not as much as I wanted to because life, but I have read a lot. It's just that I have not read a lot of nonfiction. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe and comment. What are you planning on reading for December? What are those books that you definitely want to get to? Tell me in the comments. Otherwise, tell me something that you've enjoyed reading or that you've hated reading recently. I'm always keen on hearing about that. And that's all. See you next time. Which one will I do? Okay, I just noticed there is a dedication in here, and that's nice, but also it looks like this might be a couple that broke up. Maybe that person just decluttered, but maybe they broke up.